One of the interesting aspects of this COVID-19 pandemic has been the way in which it has sharpened our minds on the fragility of life and our seemingly hopelessness in the face of the ultimate consequence of it, death. Humanity has always had a strange relationship with the reality of death. For example, before the advances we had in medicine, mortality was seen as a natural part of this thing we call life. Every time I go and visit our son's grave, I am reminded of this reality. Not just because I'm at his grave, although that's certainly a factor, but next to his grave is a family grave with the names of 8 children, whose parents seem to be visiting each year or every other year to the same site to bury one of their children. Eventually the parents were buried there as well, but many years after the last one was laid to rest. In those days, the deceased would have been laid out at home, and the family gathered around to mourn and prepare the body for burial. It was a natural part of life. With the advances of medicine, we have managed to push death out of reach a bit more. We have funeral homes that now take our loved ones and prepare them for burial rather than at home, doing for us the things we no longer feel comfortable doing, lest it causes us to reflect on our mortality and, I guess, the sureness of our own death. However, we are reminded, even in these modern times, that even science cannot have all the answers to this most vexed reality, death. The AIDS epidemic, for example, has claimed the lives of about 34 million people, and still with no real cure. Asian flu in the late 50s, just over 1 million. Hong Kong flu, 1 million. And even influenza, the modern form, despite a vaccine, claimed 80 to 120,000 or so worldwide. So how are we to respond? What can we as Christians say to a world that is gripped, if not in fear, but certainly high anxiety? Well, I think there are 2 ways to think about life. We can think about life with a finite mindset or an infinite mindset. The finite mindset recognizes that we are born, we live our life, and we die. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. For those who have this mindset, life is lived itself, what we can get out of it. Yes, we may be kind, generous, and all those other behaviours and attitudes, but we do not see anything beyond the end. In this mindset, we have a belief, even though it has no basis of fact for believing it, live a long life. In this mindset, it is usually believed that children will bury their parents, not the other way around, and that death is a long way away. This mindset speaks to people who die young, like our son Daniel, or others who die young, that they died before their time, whatever that might mean. We try very hard to keep death at arm's length, out of mind and out of sight. The other mindset, which is distinctly Christian, is the infinite mindset. In this mindset, we are playing the game of life. We come, we go, and life continues on. The same way we live life in the here and now. This mindset believes that God is sovereign, who holds the key to life. Life, therefore, needs to be lived to its fullest in the here and now, because what we do in the here and now matters in our life with God, which will go once our life ceases here. This mindset understands the truth of Psalm 139 and verse 6, which declares, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your one of them, the day were formed for me, as yet there was none of them." In this reality, there is no such thing as dying before our time, for our time of death is whether young, old, or in between. And I certainly understand that, having buried Daniel at the age of 7. Thus, the person who has the infinite mindset treasures this life and makes every influence the people around them so that they can carry on the torch forward even when we are gone from this world. and from this world we in fact will go. We see these finite and infinite mindsets at work in today's Gospel from John 14. The disciples are troubled, for they know deep down within themselves that something terrible is going to happen. Their rabbi, the one whom they believe to be the Messiah, is probably going to lose his life, and they do not know how to deal or cope with this. Their mindset is finite. Once Jesus is gone, what is going to happen to us? What is going to happen to the movement that we seem to have been starting? What's going to happen to the nation of Israel? Jesus steps into their thoughts by providing them with an infinite mindset. Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. In the 14 verses that we have for our Gospel today, Jesus speaks 4 mini sermons. The first is that he comes again to take the disciples with him to the Father. This is the ground of our Christian hope. The second is that Jesus is the exclusive way to the Father. This is the ground of our Christian faith. Thirdly, Jesus is the personal truth of the Father. This is the ground for our Christian experience. And finally, Jesus gives life from the Father. This is the ground of our prayer. But with these opening words of chapter 14, Jesus is encouraging his disciples to take their eyes off themselves for a moment and put them on him. If we are troubled by what is going on around us in the world, the solution to this being troubled is not to focus on the trouble, but to fix our eyes on Jesus. Because when we do this, when we fix our eyes on Jesus, we also fix our eyes on the Father. This is because the two are inextricably linked, as Jesus will flesh out a bit later. The Father and I are one. The reason we keep our eyes on Jesus is because the Father and Jesus are one. And where the Father is, there is room for all. As an interesting aside, the Greek word used for the rooms is mones. It's a technical term meaning a resting stop, a halfway house. Bishop Tom Wright explores this term in his wonderful book, Surprised by Hope. It is a promised place of rest as we await the resurrection of the dead, which resurrection of the dead is not a personal resurrection, but a corporate one. The point Jesus is making is that even in death, we are not abandoned by God. We are kept safe and secure in the mones, in the resting place, until the promised return of Jesus and the general resurrection of the dead. What is most important here is that Jesus is promising to return. He is coming again. This is the ground of our hope as Christian men and women, and it should be celebrated and it should be proclaimed. Then Jesus goes on to make this extraordinary claim that the only way to the Father is through him, that is Jesus. In our modern world, this seems to be an extraordinary, even problematic claim. In a world where we like to be inclusive, this seems to be a very exclusive claim. There is no wriggle room in the statement. However, the statement is inclusive. All truth is God's truth. All life is God's life. And they are finally embodied in the person of Jesus. There is no other way to God, and therefore life beyond the grave, except through Jesus. No other way. Other religions may have something to say about life, but if we want to have eternal life, then we have to go through the person of Jesus, and that means putting our faith and trust in him. This seems to be counterintuitive, but the reality is that this is inclusive. Jesus died so that all might live, but the only way for all of us to live is for all of us to put our faith and trust in him. The fantastic reality about understanding that Jesus is the only way to the Father is what the church has always made comment on. If you want to look and know and understand who God is, then you look long and lovingly at Jesus. To know Jesus is to know the Father. Therefore, we need to immerse ourselves in the Word of God, in the Gospels, and in the letters. In other words, in his scriptures. For in doing so, we come to uncover more and more about Jesus. And in uncovering more about Jesus, we uncover more about God. Finally, there is the reminder for prayer. Ask anything in my name and you will receive it. Do we believe it? It seems through our church that we have lost that sense of the power of prayer. Yes, we do say our prayers in our churches and personally, but my experience of these prayers is that they are the most ineffectual part of our liturgies. We do not seem to ask specifically of God for anything. Do we really believe that our prayers to God are heard? Do we believe that our prayer has power? We tend to pray so generally that I sometimes wonder what it is that we're supposed to say Amen to. Jesus spent much time in prayer, and his prayer was specific. We in our prayers also need to be much more specific. I suppose, if we're too general, we can feel a sense of comfort if our prayers seem to be unanswered. However, I feel very strongly that we need to have much more of a faith that God is sovereign and he does hear our prayer. When prayer seems to be unanswered, it might simply be that the response is no or not yet. So what John 14 gives us is clear ground for hope. This life is not all that there is. In God, there is life beyond this one. It is a view on life that is infinite, not finite. We can concentrate on life in this world only, and that is natural, for this is the only life that we know and understand. But life beyond this is not about facts, but about faith, hope, and trust. Faith that Jesus has indeed conquered death on the cross, and that the resurrection is the assurance of that conquering. Hope that this life is not all that there is. We do not hope in something that is not real, for that is optimism, and optimism is the antithesis of hope. We hope in a future that is promised by Jesus, who is one with the Father and who has conquered the grave. And finally, we trust that when we put our faith and hope and trust in Jesus, we will be brought into the nearer presence of the Father. That when we die, we will not be abandoned, but somehow we will rest in the nearer presence of God, waiting for the resurrection of the dead, when Jesus returns to judge the living and the dead. When we live then in the promises of John 14, we live life with an infinite mindset, and in doing so we live a life of hope, and therefore a life that is full and complete, a life of resurrection, here and now, in the expectation of a life of resurrection that is to come. In living life this way, pandemics such as COVID-19, though they may cause us concern, because we should always be concerned for when life is in jeopardy, we do not need to be anxious, for our lives are precious in the sight of God. And even if we die, our life is not ended, but embraced by God, who created us in his image, and who appointed each of our days, even before they came into being, and holds us in the palm of his hand until the day of his reappearing. The Lord be with you.